I need to check the names to avoid, then write the story. The band names are Eleanor, Lily, Jennifer, Gerald, Dorothy, Douglas, Karen, Heather, Marion, Patricia, Vivian, Cassandra, Marcus, Barb, Ruth, Colin, Natalie, Troy, Constance, Wren, Margot, Reeve. My daughter-in-law's name was Simone. That's the first thing I want you to know. Her name. Because for a long time, nobody in my family said it out loud. They said Adrian's girlfriend, and then Adrian's fiancée, and then nothing at all. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It was the long weekend in October. Not Thanksgiving the way Americans do it, the fourth Thursday of November with football and that particular kind of exhaustion, but ours, the second Monday, when the leaves in Barry have already gone full amber and the air smells like wood smoke and something finishing. I'd been cooking since Friday, torchère, because my mother made it every Thanksgiving and I've never been able to stop, even though it's not technically a Thanksgiving dish, and my son teases me about it every single year. There was squash soup, a proper roast, and a butter tart tray I'd ordered from the bakery on Dunlop Street, because mine never set right. Adrian called Thursday night to say they'd drive up from Toronto in the morning. He sounded good. Relaxed even. I remember thinking that was new. I'd met Simone twice before, once at a restaurant on Queen West, Adrian's choice, somewhere with no tablecloths and portions too small for the price, the kind of place that makes me feel old for noticing, and once at a brief coffee when she and Adrian were passing through on their way to his cousin's in Sudbury. Both times she'd been warm but a little careful, watchful maybe. I'd chalked it up to wanting to make a good impression. I do the same thing with new people. I'm 63 years old and I still get nervous at dinner parties. She arrived wearing a rust-colored wool coat I immediately wanted to ask about, and she brought me a jar of local honey from a market in Kensington, a real gift. Not a bottle of wine grabbed from a shelf, but something someone had actually thought about. I hugged her and she hugged me back, and for a moment I let myself think, this one is different. This one is going to be good for him. Adrian came in behind her carrying a bag and already on his phone. He kissed my cheek without looking up. My sister Faye was there with her husband, and my neighbor Odette, who I'd invited because she'd just lost her husband in September, and I couldn't bear the thought of her alone in that house. We sat in the living room while things finished in the oven, and I watched Simone the way mothers watch. Not obviously, just always. She talked to Faye about a film she'd seen. She helped Odette find the washroom when she asked. She laughed at something my brother-in-law said, the genuine kind of laugh, not the polite one. Adrian was across the room on the sectional, occasionally looking up from his phone. At dinner, I'd put Simone beside Faye on purpose. I wanted her to have someone easy to talk to. The conversation was good, the kind of Thanksgiving table talk that moves between nothing and everything. Hockey, and whether the drive up the 400 had been terrible, it always is, the cost of groceries, someone's renovation. Simone told a funny story about a raccoon that had gotten into their building's recycling. She was good at stories. You could tell people were listening. Then Adrian's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it and looked up at Simone. "Did you not see my text?" he said. The table didn't stop. Faye was still talking. But something in the air changed. Simone's expression didn't change either, not really. That was what I noticed. Not surprise. Not confusion. A kind of stillness that was too practiced to be natural. "Sorry," she said. "I didn't feel it. I texted you 20 minutes ago. I know, I'm sorry." He looked at her for another second, then back at his phone. The table moved on. I moved on too, outwardly. I passed the squash soup. I asked Faye if she wanted more bread. But something had snagged in me. After dinner, the men drifted to the living room. Faye and Odette were on the back porch despite the cold because Faye still smokes, secretly, in the way that fools no one. I was clearing plates and Simone was helping, rinsing things at the sink the way guests sometimes do when they're trying to be useful or trying to stay busy. I couldn't tell which. I went to the counter to wrap the leftover turati and my hand knocked my reading glasses off the edge. They slid under the kitchen island. I crouched down to get them, and that's when I saw it. Simone's phone was face up on the floor beside the cabinet, must have slipped from her pocket when she'd bent for something earlier. The screen was still lit. There were messages visible. I wasn't snooping, I want to be clear about that. I was on my hands and knees looking for a pair of drugstore reading glasses, and the messages were from a contact simply labeled A. I only saw 2 lines before the screen went dark. "You didn't answer me at the table. I don't like being ignored in front of people. I got my glasses. I stood up. I finished wrapping the tortilla. I didn't say anything. Not then. Simone was still at the sink and I looked at her back, at the careful way she was rinsing a serving spoon she'd already rinsed, and I thought about that stillness at the table again. The practiced kind. Faye came in from the porch smelling like cold air and guilty conscience and announced she needed tea, and the moment passed, and Simone picked her phone up off the floor and slipped it into her cardigan pocket without looking at it. We had butter tarts and tea. Adrian was fine the rest of the evening, charming even. He told the raccoon story better than Simone had, which I noticed she let him do, and everyone laughed. He put his arm around her on the couch. She leaned into him. I've thought about that a lot since. How you can lean into someone and be terrified of them at the same time. How those two things can exist in the same body, in the same moment, on the same old sectional sofa in your future mother-in-law's living room. They stayed the night. I've got the spare room made up year-round for Adrian, old habit from when he was in university, and the drive back to Toronto felt dangerous after a long weekend. I lay awake until past midnight thinking about 2 lines of text on a lit screen. I don't like being ignored in front of people. I've been a person for 63 years. I know what that kind of sentence means. In the morning, I made eggs, and Adrian slept until 10. Simone came down at 8:30 and sat at the kitchen table with both hands around a mug of coffee, and I put a plate of toast in front of her and sat down across from her, and I said, very quietly, "Are you all right?" She looked at me. Her eyes were careful. "I'm good," she said. "Thank you for dinner. Everything was really lovely." "Simone," I kept my voice even. "I'm asking because I want to know, not as small talk." Something moved across her face. A very small thing. Like a door opening a crack and then thinking better of it. "I'm fine," she said again. But she didn't look away, and she didn't reach for the toast. I didn't push. I've learned at my age that pushing too hard closes things faster than it opens them. I just nodded and said, "Okay," and got up to check on something at the stove that didn't need checking on. But I also left my phone number on a sticky note beside her coffee cup while she was looking out the window at the backyard. She didn't mention it. Adrian came down and ate 4 pieces of toast, and they drove back to Toronto by noon. He hugged me at the door the way he always does, the good hug, the one that lasts a second longer than it needs to. And I hugged him back, and I thought, I raised you. I know who you are at your best. I am looking, right now, at a man who is not at his best. I didn't know what to do with that. For 3 weeks, I did nothing. I told myself I'd misread it. I told myself one uncomfortable text doesn't make someone an abuser. I told myself Simone was an adult woman who'd made her own choices and it wasn't my place. I told myself all the things we tell ourselves when we don't want to see what we're seeing. Then Faye called me on a Tuesday. She'd run into Simone at the Loblaws on Yonge Street. Faye goes down to Toronto for her daughter's kids every other week. She was picking up groceries after. She said Simone had seemed startled to see her. The kind of startled that looked like fear before it rearranged itself into pleasant surprise. They'd talked for 10 minutes in the cereal aisle. Simone had kept checking her phone. She'd apologized twice for things that hadn't required apology. When Faye said she should come up to Barrie sometime, just the girls, just for a visit, Simone had said she'd have to check with Adrian first. She said it like it was normal, Faye said. Like asking permission was just a thing people did. "I know," I said. "Bev," Faye said. "That's my name, Beverly. Bev to anyone who knows me. What are we going to do?" I didn't have an answer that night, but I started paying attention differently after that. Adrian called twice in November. Both times he mentioned Simone in ways that seemed designed to tell me things without telling me things. She'd been in a mood. She'd overreacted to something small. She was a lot sometimes. Each time I listened and said very little, and after I hung up, I sat with the discomfort of knowing that I was hearing one side of a story that had another side I would never be allowed to hear from him. I called Simone directly in late November. I'd had her number since she gave it to me before Thanksgiving in case we needed to coordinate driving. I wasn't sure she'd pick up. She did on the 3rd ring, and she sounded immediately wary. Not of me, I think, but of what it might mean that I was calling. Whether Adrian knew, whether he'd asked me to. "He doesn't know I'm calling," I said right away. "This isn't about him. I just wanted to check in." A pause. That's really kind of you. Simone, I'm going to ask you something and you don't have to answer it, but I'd rather ask it than not. I stood at my kitchen window looking out at the street. The neighbors' Christmas lights were already up. Are you safe? Silence. Long enough that I thought she might hang up. She started. Why are you asking that? Because I saw something at Thanksgiving that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. Another pause. When she spoke again, her voice was different. Smaller, not in a frightened way, in the way voices get when someone has been holding something at arm's length for a long time and suddenly it's right there, close. It's not bad, she said. It's not like what you're probably thinking. Okay, I said. What is it like? She didn't answer that. But she also didn't hang up. We talked for 40 minutes. She didn't tell me everything. I didn't expect her to. What she told me was enough that Adrian kept track of her in ways she'd initially thought were care and had slowly understood were something else. That he didn't like her spending time with her friends without telling him exactly where she'd be and when she'd be home. That he went through her phone sometimes, not violently, just he'd pick it up and she'd feel like she had to not react. That when she brought up getting her own savings account, she'd read an article about financial independence, she wasn't planning anything, she'd just mentioned it over dinner. He'd been cold to her for 5 days, that she'd stopped mentioning things, that she'd gotten good at not mentioning things. He loves me, she said at one point. I know it doesn't sound like anything, I said. I know he does. That's not the question. I didn't tell her what to do. I'm not her mother, and even if I were, I've lived long enough to know that telling a woman to leave a relationship she's not ready to leave accomplishes nothing except making her feel more alone. What I did tell her was this, that what she'd described had a name, and it wasn't love, and it wasn't her fault, and she didn't have to figure out what to do about it tonight. And I told her she could call me, anytime. That the call would be between us. She thanked me in a voice I'll remember for the rest of my life. The next 3 months were the hardest I've had in a long time, and they didn't even happen to me. I know that's important to say. I was on the periphery of someone else's hard months. I was sleeping in my own bed in Barrie and eating regular meals and going to my book club on Thursdays. Simone was living inside it. She texted me sometimes. Nothing dramatic. Updates, really. Small things. He'd gotten upset because she'd come home 20 minutes later than she'd said she would. He'd told her friends were a bad influence, that they didn't have her best interests at heart. He'd said something about the engagement ring. Something about how she didn't appreciate what he'd spent, how she didn't appreciate things the way she should. She told me that one carefully, like she wasn't sure it counted. I asked her once if she'd thought about talking to someone. A professional, I meant. She said she'd looked up some resources but hadn't made an appointment because Adrian used their shared credit card and she didn't know how to explain the charge. That was when I understood what we were actually dealing with. I found the Assaulted Women's Helpline. In Ontario, you can call or text, available around the clock, and I texted her the number without comment. She sent back a single heart emoji. Small, but she sent it. In February, she called me on a Sunday afternoon, and her voice was the kind of quiet that isn't calm. I think I need to go, she said. Okay, I said. Do you need somewhere to go to? She didn't have family nearby. Her parents were out in BC. She had a friend in Mississauga she trusted, but she was scared Adrian would know to look there first. I said she could come to Barrie. I have the spare room. She could stay as long as she needed to. I see this, knowing that when Adrian found out, and he would find out, it would change things between us in ways I couldn't fully predict. He is my son. I love him. I also knew that Sunday that loving him and helping Simone were not mutually exclusive, and that if I chose my comfort over her safety, I would have to live with that choice for the rest of my life. She came up on a Tuesday. Adrian was at work. She took what she could fit in 2 bags and her work laptop and her cat, a small gray thing named after a street in Montreal, and she drove up the 400 in her own car and arrived at my house at 2 in the afternoon, and when I opened the door she stood on my porch for a second before she started crying. I just held on to her. She stayed for 6 weeks. Adrian called me the Tuesday night after he'd come home to an empty apartment. I've thought a lot about how to describe that call. He was angry. He was also frightened, I think, in the way that people who need control are always frightened underneath it. because the thing they're most afraid of is someone leaving, and here it was happening. He said she'd clearly manipulated me. He said I didn't know the full story. He said things I won't repeat here because they hurt and because I think some part of him is ashamed of them now. I told him I loved him. I told him I wasn't going to discuss where she was or what her plans were. I told him that when he was ready to talk, really talk, not accuse, I was here. He hung up. He didn't call back for 11 weeks. When he did, he was different. Not fixed. I want to be honest about that, because this isn't a story where everything resolves neatly in 5 months. But he was quieter. He'd been seeing someone, a therapist. He said it awkwardly, the way men of his generation sometimes do, like the word itself is embarrassing. I told him I was glad. I meant it. He and Simone did not get back together. That was her choice, made clearly and on her own timeline, and I respected it completely. She has her own apartment now in Hamilton. She wanted to change from Toronto. And she has a job she likes, and she got a dog, eventually, in addition to the cat. A ridiculous golden retriever puppy who she sends me photos of sometimes. She still texts me. Not often, but enough. I think people expect there to be a lesson in stories like this. A tidy one. Love your family, trust your instincts, something like that. And maybe there is. But what I find myself sitting with, more than any clean moral, is the question of what I would have done if I hadn't dropped my glasses. If I hadn't crouched down at just that moment and seen a phone screen in the 2 seconds before it went dark, I'd like to think I would have found my way to the same place eventually. I'd like to think those weeks of something snagged would have grown into something I couldn't ignore. Maybe that's true. Maybe I would have made the same call in late November either way, but I also know how easy it is to not see what you don't want to see. I raised Adrian. I loved Adrian. He is still my son, and I still love him, and that is not a simple thing to hold. What I know is this. I saw a lit screen on a kitchen floor, and I chose to believe what I saw, and I chose to act on it. And Simone is in Hamilton with a golden retriever and a lease in her own name, and I know, when she texts me photos, that she is all right. That has to be enough. Most days it is. I've been thinking about cause and effect a lot since all of this happened. Not in any grand philosophical way. I'm a 63-year-old woman from Barrie who reads library books and makes tourtière every October. I'm not a philosopher, but I do think about how one small thing leads to another and how the whole shape of a life can turn on something as ordinary as dropping your glasses. If I hadn't crouched down at that exact moment, I would have gone to bed that Thanksgiving night with nothing more than a vague discomfort I couldn't name. That discomfort might have faded. I might have told myself I was imagining things, being overprotective, projecting. I've done it before. Most people have. We are very good at convincing ourselves not to see what we don't want to see, especially when what we don't want to see involves someone we love. That's the thing nobody talks about honestly when they tell stories like this one. It wasn't easy to make that call to Simone in late November. It wasn't easy to leave my number on a sticky note beside her coffee cup. It wasn't easy to tell Adrian, my own son, that I wasn't going to tell him where she was. Each of those things cost me something real. I paid for them in lost sleep and in the 11 weeks of silence from my son, and in the particular grief of watching someone you raised become someone you don't entirely recognize. But I think about what the alternative would have cost Simone, and I can't find a version of that calculation where staying quiet was the right answer. What I've come to understand, slowly, imperfectly, the way you understand most true things, is that integrity isn't a feeling. It's not the warm certainty you're doing the right thing. Half the time I felt terrified. Half the time I second-guessed myself completely. Integrity is the decision you make when you're scared and uncertain, and it would be so much easier to look away. It's the sticky note you leave anyway. It's the phone call you make anyway. It's opening your spare room to someone who needs it, knowing it will cost you. And courage isn't the absence of fear either. Simone showed more courage than anyone in this story. She drove up the 400 with 2 bags and a cat and her whole life uncertain in front of her. And she stood on my porch and let herself cry. And that took more bravery than most people will ever have to find. She didn't know how it would turn out. She just knew she couldn't stay. I think that's what I want to leave you with. Not a lesson, exactly. More of an observation from someone who has lived long enough to see how these things tend to go. The people who act with honesty, who choose the harder right thing over the easier silence, who find the nerve to ask the uncomfortable question, they don't always get rewarded immediately. Sometimes they get hung up on. Sometimes they sit with 11 weeks of quiet, but they also get to live with themselves afterward. And that turns out to matter more than I would have thought when I was younger. Simone sends me photos of her dog sometimes. A ridiculous golden retriever who has already chewed through 2 pairs of her shoes. She seems happy, not fixed. I don't think people who've been through what she's been through are ever simply fixed, but present. Like someone who has returned to herself after a long time away. That's enough. It really is.